Now, you mentioned pharmacopoeia a few moments ago, and my question is, was she the ancient Greek muse of pharmacists? This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stone was Mazarin, the carbuncle was blue, and the mane was lion, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about what kind of chemistry experiments Sherlock Holmes was running? Or what a yeggman is? Or why Holmes's index was sorted haphazardly?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 382. Will the real devil's foot stand up? Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you upstanding today?
I'm absolutely upstanding. In fact, I'm standing up and I'm completely vertical. Not even slightly horizontal.
You know, you don't only stand up, but you stand out.
I stand up, I stand out. I actually stand around a lot, particularly when other people are working. I like to be there sort of in the background, not doing anything, but looking like I'm participating.
You sound like you're the ideal candidate for the International Podcasters Workers Union.
Oh, no. We need action. We need action to, correct the huge injustice and imbalance in all of the people, like you listeners. Yes, I'm talking about you who consume podcasts, but don't support the International Podcast Workers Union of people who are struggling to buy throat lozenges and attend diction lessons so that they can manufacture
quality
time-consuming episodes that take you from the dull burden of care into the world of speculative and often unsupported conversation.
Well, speaking of injustice and imbalance, that was Burt Wolder. But this is why we have the editing feature here on Trifles, something that we throw in free of charge.
Not me. What do you expect?
Oh boy!
You throw me a bone like that, I'm not going to pass up an opportunity to chew on.
Sit, Fido, sit. We're not here to talk about podcasting workers' unions or any kind of editing. We're just going to go straight for it. This episode is an investigation of, as you may have guessed, devil's foot. But what was the devil's foot root, actually? What in the pharmacopoeia did it actually represent? We actually have three different pieces that we're going to be drawing from here as we try to put an identity to the devil's foot root. Meanwhile, if you would like to support us in our venture to find throat lozenges, that's always welcome. You can do that by going to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. We do have some thank you gifts, some merch for our supporters there on Patreon, and we have bonus content as well. And if you'd just like to go the Substack route, well, we will send you email updates and you will have access to bonus episodes there as well, just without the merch. Pick whichever one works for you. We don't care, but we do appreciate that you choose to support us in whatever format makes sense for you. Okay, well, we will get into this without any further ado, lest we get ourselves into trouble, which we'll probably end up doing anyway. But I don't know exactly how this came to my attention, but I happen to be thinking about Devil's Foot. And, in the case of Devil's Foot, Holmes and Watson are in Cornwall. They are called to investigate a rather gruesome scene by virtue of the vicar. Vicar Roundhay, was it?
Yes, well remembered.
Reverend Roundhay. Over at the Tregennis house, brothers George and Owen were taken away, stark raving mad, and Sister Brenda was dead. They were seated around the card table there, and no one could tell exactly what drove the two of them out of their minds and one to certain death. Until another Tregennis turned up, the brother, Mortimer. Also dead. And in between all of this was the great lion hunter and explorer, Leon Sterndale. Holmes and Watson, spoiler alert, determined that there was a combustible element involved, and the inhaled smoke caused madness and death. And even tested it out on themselves in the name of science. But we have a few scholars in the Baker Street Journal over the years wondering exactly what would have caused this. And I have to say, there are some interesting suppositions out there.
You're absolutely right. Well, this has been written about, as you just said, frequently over the years, and I know there are a lot of theories, but the essay in the Baker Street Journal from June 1965. Oh, wait a minute. Is this June 1965?
68.
68, right.
Yeah.
From volume 42, number 2 by Robert S. Ennis, which is titled...
That's 92. Sorry.
92.
1992.
Okay. With the essay, which is titled Devil's Foot or Angel Dust, is one of the best. It's one of the tightest and one of the shorter, and it also begins, interestingly, by Ennis, who is pointing to an experience that he had when he was an extern, a young extern at Bellevue Hospital in New York. He was discovering that in the late 1960s, what he called the turn-on, tune-out crowd was finding sinister substitutes for LSD. And there was a young man in the emergency room who had smoked something laced with a new street drug called angel dust, or PCP. Ennis says his face was contorted with terror. He was incoherent, shouting, flailing his arms and legs. It was with difficulty that 3 strong orderlies held him down. His blood pressure was sky high. We almost lost him. The psychiatric resident diagnosed him as suffering from drug-induced psychosis, more severe than any he'd ever encountered. The young man spent the next year and a half in a mental institution, and I'd almost forgotten him, says Ennis, until I read The Adventure of the Devil's Foot.
And in his recounting of the Devil's Foot, he reminds us that in Victorian England, pharmacology wasn't as advanced as it was in his day, the 1990s, and obviously even more so now. The effects of drugs were not really well known by physicians any more than they were by the general public. Because in those days, you could just walk across the street to the chemist and pick up some cocaine or opium. And there weren't any laws to prohibit or regulate the use of these chemicals. And you recall, even in the Study in Scarlet, when Watson was being introduced to Holmes by Stamford, Stamford said, I could imagine him giving his friend a little pinch of the latest vegetable alkaloid. Not out of malevolence, you understand, but simply out of a spirit of inquiry. in order to have an accurate idea of the effects. So that's the time frame that we find ourselves in with respect to these mind-altering drugs.
And there was an episode in Conan Doyle's own life early in his medical career. I don't remember the exact substance he was ingesting, but in that spirit of inquiry, he was taking progressively stronger doses of this substance to determine, at one level, would it be, impossible to ingest any more. Now, why he was doing this, I don't know, but I do recall that he made himself very sick. So this notion of, today we have trials and clinical trials and research studies, but in those days, the physician or the researcher occasionally thought that he would make an ideal subject himself, and so let's have a try at this, and there you are.
As long as you survive and are able to report on the effects, then I suppose it's a useful process. But one slip, one grain too many of the drug, and you may be lost to the pages of history.
Well, and Holmes did that, of course. We have Sign of Four and this conversation with Watson, where Watson inquires, which is it today, morphine or cocaine? And later in The Man with the Twisted Lip, Holmes, who is disguised as an opium smoker, insists that he'd not added opium to his cocaine or morphine habit. But in any case, with The Devil's Foot in the spring of 1897, his personal physician, Dr. Moore Agar of Harley Street, of whom we will never hear any more, advised him to lay aside all his cases and get a rest to avert a complete breakdown.
Ironic that Moore Agar should warn Holmes away from this overexertion and occasional indiscretions of his own, which could be code for drug use, only to have Holmes go to Cornwall to engage in more drug use.
Say, is the recording still going?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yes, that is ironic. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, that is pretty interesting.
But ultimately, that was enough to solve him of the habit in the end.
Yeah. Well, Watson tells us, at the very first whiff of it, my brain and my imagination were beyond all control. A freezing horror took possession of me. Holmes's face was white, rigid, and drawn with horror. And then, of course, Dr. Sterndale describes the drug made from a powder of the radix, pedis, dioaboli, an obscure poison that stimulates brain centers which control the emotion of fear, says Sterndale. And either madness or death is the fate of those who are subjected to the ordeal. Well, Ennis says, so what is it? A review of the world's current literature in botany, pharmacology, and toxicology finds no mention of it. And there have been articles. Dr. Peter Cooper in the Baker Street Journal in 1968 suggested the substance was muavi or erythrophleum guineens, an ordeal drug of the Congo that could be lethal in small amounts when ingested orally. And then we learn that there are variations of this species of drug in Thailand, Madagascar, Cambodia. Plenty of alkaloids which cause a digitalis-like effect on the heart. Reports of accidental poisonings, but there's no mention in literature of any hallucinogenic effect.
And in another article that Ennis references, Herb Tinning in 1976 said that even at the time that Dr. Sterndale had discovered devil's foot root, the plant was almost extinct. A combination of climatological changes over the years in the area where the plant propagated, as well as a lack of resistance to a rare fungus disease, ensured its demise. And here Tinning has an interesting image. It's a sculpture that was given to him by a seminarian at the General Theological Seminary in New York City, whose interests range from pottery to African artifacts. Among her collection was an almost life-size sculpture of the half-human, half-goat-like devil's foot root. She explained it had more than likely been sculpted by a 19th century native artisan who recognized that the devil's foot root would shortly become as unknown to science as was the remarkable worm, and wished to preserve a replica for posterity. So Herb had that in his collection, that cloven hoof, which of course the goat, the cloven hoof relates to popular images of the devil. So hence the connection there.
Must be hard to get loafers if you have a cloven hoof. Well, but Dr. Sterndale tells us, in addition to the sample he handily brought with him from Africa, only one other sample existed, and it was in the laboratory at Buda in Hungary. And Ennis tracks that to Hungary's largest commercial center, was famous for, among other things, chemicals and pharmaceuticals. And so when World War I began in 1914, Germany was aligned with Austro-Hungary, and that was the first conflict in which chemical warfare was introduced on a large scale. Well, Ennis says, I believe it's likely that during the early years of the war, the lone sample of brownish snuff-like powder was taken from its repository in Buda to facilities in Germany, and that ingredient was isolated, synthesized, and made into a potent poison nerve gas for the war effort. But happily, the war ended in 1918 before the plan could be put into effect, and the laboratory in Buda might have been destroyed in the Hungarian uprising in 1956. But it is perhaps not a coincidence that a few years later a new drug called phencyclidine, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, surfaced in Germany, thought to be the ultimate anesthetic agent, and was widely studied.
So this is interesting. He says it fell out of favor because of the occurrence of severe, frequently disabling hallucinations that accompanied its use. A less potent derivative, ketamine, is still widely in use as an anesthetic agent today. Although abandoned over the next 4 decades, phencyclidine, or PCP, as it's known, has become one of the most frightening and frequently used drugs of abuse in the United States. Now, he says you can categorize hallucinogenic drugs into 4 basic groups. The alkaloid derivatives, the piperidine derivatives, phenylethylamines, and the cannabinols. Examples include LSD, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, marijuana, psilocybin, mescaline, and PCP. And while some of these are taken orally, others by injection or by smoking, only PCP is known to be able to cause complex hallucinations, which can result in severe, irreversible paranoid psychosis and accompanied panic reactions. So you think about George and Owen, who got carted off to Helston in this maddening state, and we assume they were committed there for the rest of their natural lives. It's very similar to what Dr. Ennis just described with respect to PCP.
Fascinating. Ennis says PCP is most frequently used by sprinkling a tiny amount on smoking material, like parsley, tobacco, or marijuana, and inhaling the fumes. And it was considered to be the most dangerous agent on the American so-called recreational drug scene. Well, he says it's my hypothesis that the active ingredient of radix pedis dioaboli, the devil's foot root, is none other than PCP, isolated in a secret German chemical laboratory during the First World War. The psychotic behavior of the surviving brothers, the sudden bizarre death of the sister, and of Mortimer Tregennis in a convulsion of terror, and the description of the panic reaction experienced by Watson and Holmes are all classic of PCP intoxication.
And he concludes noting the irony that the devil's foot may indeed be PCP, which is commonly known as angel dust. Devil's foot, angel dust. How do you like that? Well, it seems that its effects are far more devilish than they are angelic. But a fascinating, I think a fascinating analysis and survey from one who knows the pharmacopoeia more than most, from Dr. Robert Ennis there. And I don't know of any other analyses other than the two that he mentioned here by Cooper and Tinning of people trying to determine what devil's foot actually was. So, but I don't have any other better suggestions. Do you?
No, not at all. I think it's a beautifully reasoned, tightly written little paper there.
Okay, as we threatened you at the top of the show, this is the drawing where all of our paid subscribers are automatically entered to win a possible back issue of the Baker Street Journal. All you have to do to be eligible for this is to join us at patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com and be a paid subscriber at the level of your choice on Patreon. I think there is only one price on Substack. There are rewards on Patreon. Substack is more straightforward, but whatever works for you, you pick, and you are automatically entered. So let's haul out the prize wheel and give it a big spin. It's going around and slowing to land on number 51. Number 51, and that is Herman Campbell. From over on Substack. Herman, thank you so much for being a subscriber, and we will get in touch and make sure we have your information to send you a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. Again, if you'd like to join the likes of Herman, have an opportunity to win every month, all you have to do is go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. Well, take that as just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes. Have you ever heard of radix, pedis, dioaboli?
Devil's foot root. No, I can't say that I have.
Uh-huh. Well, it is no reflection upon your professional knowledge. For I believe that save for one sample in a laboratory in Buda, there is no other specimen in Europe. It is used as an ordeal poison by the medicine men in certain districts of West Africa. And it is kept as a secret by them.